Okay, our guest has been a professor of history at North Central College in Naperville since 1991. She's an expert on a subject that really interests Dave and I very much. Today we're going to talk about Chicago history with somebody who knows more about it than anyone you have ever met. And Durkin Keating will be on the show right after this.
The following is a Tony Lasano podcast, an Opie show on the Radio Misfits Podcast Network. This is the Minutia Men Celebrity Interview with Rick and Dave.
Okay, so no Dave this week, unfortunately. He had a death in the family. He can't be here today, but we're going to carry on without him because we have a very special guest. If the history professor credit's not enough for you, how about this list of books? She wrote about the birth of Chicago in the book Rising Up from Indian Country. She wrote about the origins of the suburbs in the book Chicagoland Cities and Suburbs in the Railroad Age. Her book, The World of Juliet Kinsey, is about Chicago before the fire. And one of her books is prominently displayed here in my bookcase at home. She is the co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Chicago. So when I say that she knows Chicago history, I'm not just blowing smoke. Welcome to the show, Ann Keating. How are you, Ann?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Sure, of course. This is, one of our favorite subjects. So I want to start here with the Juliet Kinsey book, because one of the things I used to do with my boys, I've got 3 grown sons, and when they were little, we'd walk around Chicago and I'd tell them who the streets were named after. And Kinsey is one of those names. If you've ever been to Harry Carey's restaurant downtown, you've been on Kinsey. It's not named after Juliet. It's named after John. Tell us a little bit about John and Juliet and this treasure trove of letters that you have.
Oh, yeah. So when I was doing the project on the War of 1812 in Chicago, I did study Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. And du Sable sells his holdings at the mouth of the Chicago River, so not far from Harry Carey's, to John Kinsey Sr. And John Kinsey Sr. comes in, and he's at Chicago during the Fort Dearborn era, so in the first couple of decades of the 19th century. And John Kinsey then is at Chicago during the War of 1812, and he's living in DuSable's house, and he raises a family, and they're living in Indian country, right? So they're living in this... They're a trading outpost in this Potawatomi world with the fort across the way from them. So they're really living far away out in this island. And they've got 3 or 4 kids. He and his wife, Eleanor, have, 4 children. And the oldest son is named for his father. So we've got a second John Kinsey. And that John Kinsey is works for the American Fur Company during the 1820s. So he's up in Mackinac. And so if you've been up to Mackinac, to the fort up at Mackinac, it's kind of fun because it gets you close to the Kinseys and a lot of other people from this era to be able to walk around up in Mackinac. And so John Kinsey then the elder dies in 1827, and his son is going to come back to Chicago. And he marries a woman from the East, Juliet Kinsey, whose uncle had been in Chicago and knew the Kinsey family. And she's just enamored with the West. And she wants to write books about the West. And she draws maps, and she does paintings, and she writes about this for everyone back east. She's from Connecticut. And so the Kinsey family then is at Chicago from when they arrive in 1803. There are still Kinseys in the Chicago area down to the present, but Juliet's the one that really makes a big she writes the first history of Chicago. So wow. Yeah, she's a very interesting character alongside of both her, more to your point, more illustrious father and husband, but father-in-law and husband, but really an interesting character. It was a lot of fun, and so she wrote a lot. She wrote a lot of history, but she also wrote these letters. Yeah. So I can talk more. I would talk more, but you probably want something else. Yeah.
No. I'm curious about the letters themselves. Like, where were these letters stored?
Oh, yeah. So Juliet lives in a house that's at what's now Illinois and Wabash. So it's basically a hole in the ground now. I mean, there's a parking lot, but it's on a double-decker. It's one of those places on the near north side that you've got two layers, going back to the Burnham plan with but at any rate, she lives in one of the first brick houses in the 1830s. She lives there from 1837 until 1867, so through the 1850s when the railroad first comes through town and when they get industry. So Cyrus McCormick's reaper plant is right down the block, and the first railroad station is right there, and the grain elevators that go up right around her house, which was in the country with cows when it was built in the 1830s, but by the 1850s is right smack dab on the middle of the near north side. And she then stays there through the late 1860s when she has to sell the house. So her daughter has moved to Savannah, Georgia, before the Civil War. So back in 1857, and a lot of the letters were written to her daughter in the 1850s, and 1860s. Juliet dies in 1870, the year before the Chicago fire, and so her daughter is in Savannah and hangs on to these letters.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's very cool. And her daughter is married into the Gordon family. And I was a Girl Scout for many, many years. And Juliet Gordon Lowe is the founder of the Girl Scouts in the United States. And we made the trek I can remember as an 8th grader making the trek to Savannah, Georgia with the Girl Scouts from Chicago, with 2 busloads of Girl Scouts from Chicago. And lo and behold, as it turns out, the Juliet Gordon Lowe is named after Juliet Kinsey. She's the granddaughter of the Chicagoan, Juliet Kinsey. And so the letters got saved in Savannah. And I saw a lot of them at the Georgia Historical Society, which is a pretty wild place for these letters from early Chicago to be, and also at the University of North Carolina. But the Chicago Historical Society has a microfilm copy of a lot of the letters. Okay. I don't know whether you've run into a guy named Paul Engel, but he was the head of the Chicago what's now the Historical Society History Museum for many years, and he just collected things. So he got a microfilm copy in the 1950s of these, so they were fun.
You know, so little is discussed about Chicago's role in the Civil War.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah.
But, you know, I recently stumbled onto the Stephen Douglas tomb on the near south side, which is spectacular.
Isn't it? Yeah.
No idea it was even there. I've lived in Chicago. I'm 62 years old. I've lived in Chicago my whole life. I had no idea that was there. I mean, we know that Lincoln obviously spent a lot of time here. What was Chicago like during the Civil War? What was going on here in Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, so Stephen Douglas is actually a Chicagoan. He moves to Chicago in 1848 or 49, buys a lot of property on the south side. So where his tomb is at 35th and right at the icy track, so close to Lakeshore Drive, that's property that he owned going back to 1850. So Lincoln comes to Chicago a lot, but he's Springfield.
Right.
Douglas really, really settles into Chicago, and he helps to promote the railroads and a lot of development in Chicago in the 1850s. So you get to the famous 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates. Well, they kind of start in Chicago, and then they formalize, and they have this series of debates. But it's Stephen Douglas versus Abraham Lincoln, and it's really 2 very different visions for the country moving forward. And Douglas wins in 1858, but then Lincoln challenges Douglas. He gets the nomination from this new Republican Party in 1860. And so Abraham Lincoln is elected president. And Douglas, who had been his rival all along, when we get Fort Sumter in April of 1861, Stephen Douglas says, I'm I'm 100%, 1,000% behind Abraham Lincoln and the United States against the Confederacy. So Douglas is really a crucial figure in in getting Democrats across the North on board with the war effort, so that it's seen as a effort of both Republicans and Democrats. I mean, Douglas is a complicated guy.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of issues with his attitudes about slavery and race they present a real foil to the vision that Abraham Lincoln is going to bring forward. But they're both there. So they're debating in 1858. They're both in the city in 1860. Douglas dies shortly after the start of the Civil War in May of 1861. And this enormous funeral in Chicago along the lakefront, and then his burial there at the site where they're going to then put the monument up over his grave a couple of decades later. But he's buried there, and then just 4 years later, it's Abraham Lincoln who's been assassinated, and his funeral cortege basically goes through the same thing. So both the same places in Chicago. So really, both men have really strong ties to Chicago, and so both of them send off a lot of the key generals, businessmen, the people who make the war happen are going to be coming out of Chicago. So it's the tie here. There's a guy named Ted Karamansky, and he works with his wife, Eileen McMahon, and they have done some really interesting work on the Civil War in Chicago. So it's fun.
You mentioned that Douglas is a complicated guy. I think that's pretty fair to say of all the famous Chicagoans from those early days.
Absolutely.
Because they were, they were risk takers just to even be here, right? And then you've got you walk. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know some of these other names on streets in Chicago, like Wacker and Clark, Ogden, Dearborn. Pick your poison. Tell us about any of those other people that were around in those early days.
Okay, I can give you a couple of those right off the bat. So Henry Dearborn was the Secretary of State when Fort Dearborn is founded in 1803. So he's Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. Wow. So his name is tied to Chicago through the military. So it's really, that's a military name tied to Chicago. William Ogden. So Ogden Avenue, he's the first mayor of Chicago. I would say if you're picking one person who's instrumental in launching Chicago, it's Ogden. Ogden comes to Chicago in 1835, so he's only in Chicago a couple of years when he's elected mayor. But he comes in, he's a fairly wealthy man. He comes, though, to represent his brother-in-law's interests. His brother-in-law is a New Yorker by the name of Charles Butler, and Butler has bought a lot of land in Chicago, and William Ogden thinks it's a really bad investment when he first comes, and then changes his mind. So he's the guy. He's really important for getting a lot of the improvements. So to your point, the people who go-getters who really put Chicago on the map. He's going to work to make sure the canal finally gets built. He's going to be the guy that goes out and sells people on creating the Galena and Chicago Railroad, and both of those will open in 1848, and Ogden's instrumental there. He's going to convince Cyrus McCormick to move his reaper plant to Chicago at about the same time. He's going to help to organize the Board of Trade. He works he's a really interesting guy. When I first got started in doing Chicago history, I was interested in water systems and how we get our first water supply. And Ogden was like, we have to have a better water supply. We have to have a sewerage system in Chicago. We have to raise the streets up off the grade in the 1850s. Yeah. And he's really behind so many of those things. He's only mayor for 1 year, but he's really behind so many pieces of our story. Yeah. Wacker's later. Rick, he's
Right.
so Wacker's a 20th century story, but Dearborn and Ogden definitely. I mean, Wacker takes us to Burnham and the Burnham Plan, but he's right there. So Wacker is a really interesting man. He's a German who is an incredibly successful real estate developer and businessman who really helps to implement the Burnham Plan, because the plan is in 1909 and Burnham dies in 1912, but it's Wacker and the men in the Chicago Plan Commission that are really going to put a lot of the pieces of the Burnham Plan, like Lakeshore Drive and the park system along the lakefront and the riverfront. I mean, the Burnham Plan is the place where where there was really this first thought of having something that would eventually come to be what our Riverwalk is, right? I mean, the idea of that the river would be a place for to enjoy, instead of being an open sewer
Right.
or a harbor, because it was a harbor when Burnham was thinking about this. So it's all, I mean, these folks,
They're visionaries, really. I mean,
they really, really are. You're absolutely right.
so, I'm a lifelong North Sider. In modern day Chicago, the North Side is, considered a little more upscale than the South Side, but it hasn't always been that way. In fact, it kind of was the last part of Chicago to develop, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's I think it's different because the South Side's got some really big industries, right? So it's got most of the steel mills and the stockyards. And the North Side's going to be smaller industry along the river that's going to develop. It's got it brings in a lot of early on in the mid 19th century. You see a lot of Germans coming in to found. Because there's a lot of lumber coming into the city, so furniture making becomes really important. And German craftsmen will come to Chicago, and they're going to create smaller factories, but important ones, where they're going to manufacture furniture, but also pieces for housing and really transform those industries of making houses, so that you start to have the pieces of housing that are going to be more standardized. So I think it's a really interesting story. So on any given block, in the area around Lincoln Park, there would have been a factory probably, and as well as housing, and that kind of a mix of housing and factories and warehouses was, I think, really characteristic of the North Side. The South Side's a little more, it's a bigger scale,
Yeah.
the development that's taking place. So it's going to be a different kind. I mean, some of it's going to be very similar. I don't like to overstate that, but to your point, it's a different kind of development that's taking place.
Well, as a German, that's why I know so much about the North Side, because there's that. Have you ever been to the Dunkhalle on the North
at
Side?
Lincoln Square,
In Lincoln
right?
Square, yeah. There's all kinds of really cool stuff in there. If people are visiting Chicago, I recommend to check it out.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, Germans make Chicago. I mean, our love of the water, our housing stock, the skilled work. So a lot of the early industrialization is going to be even in the stockyards with butchers. So I mean, Germans are really farmers.
Don't forget the beer.
And don't forget the mayors, right?
That's right.
We've got it's fun. It really is. But I mean, German was heard on the streets of Chicago in the late 19th century. I always think about it very akin to hearing Spanish today.
Yeah.
That it's as German a city in the 19th century as we are a Latino city here in the 21st century.
So we just published. I'm a publisher. We just published a book called Celtic Knot or Celtic Knot, which
Oh,
takes
cool.
place in the rough and tumble days of Chicago, right after the fire. And
Oh, wow.
Chicago, always an exciting place, but always very dangerous, especially in those days. Isn't that true?
Oh yeah, and especially when you think about Irish nationalists who are raising money and scheming in Chicago in the 1860s and 1870s.
Right, exactly. Sure. But I mean, the neighborhoods there. I mean, they had the whole Levee district and it was almost like the Vegas of America at some point, wasn't it?
Oh, I think that's a fair assessment. It's a wide open place, particularly on the near south side, with in the Levee district with Long John.
Yeah,
Hockman and McKenna, Mark McKenna. I mean, they're saloon keepers and who are giving and taking bribes, and
luckily that's changed.
Yeah. I mean,
let's say yes.
Yes.
So, I wrote a book called Every Cub Ever, which is, as the title implies, about every cub ever. And one of the things I hate is when people pick up the book and they quiz me on specific names. I mean, and I can't remember everything, which brings me to the Encyclopedia of Chicago.
Oh my gosh!
As one of the editors of that book, you obviously know every single thing in there, right?
No.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to open the book and point to it. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm guessing that working on a book like that inspired your subsequent books. I mean, you must have come across things as you were putting that book together that you're like, I'd like to know more about that.
Oh, Rick, you got this. You are thinking like historian. You are a historian because you're thinking that way.
Right.
That's exactly right. It's like you get in the middle of something and it's like, oh, that's really interesting. I can't do it right now, but I got to write it down or I got to remember this.
It's a sickness, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. But it's also, it will keep us going forever and ever and ever. So I'm not going to complain about it too much, but no, sickness is another way to think about it. The people around us certainly feel that way.
Yes,
some days.
Yes. On behalf of my wife, I'll say yes, that is true.
But I mean, no, so there were two things that I took over in the encyclopedia. One of them was I was in charge of all of the neighborhood and suburban entries. So I edited all of the geographic entries for the book. So I really thought a lot about suburbs. So the book I did on suburbs came out of that. And then the other thing is I was responsible for everything that took place in Chicago before the fire.
Oh, okay.
So
that's a small little
it's just a little piece.
Yeah.
And when I started doing Chicago history, I really started in 1830. So I started when Chicago was a real estate deal, so it's the first plat for Chicago. And I didn't really think much about the history that came before that. And one of the things the encyclopedia did, and also teaching has done for me, is just like, good grief, there's an enormous amount of history before 1830 in Chicago. So that kind of sent me down many, many rabbit holes on that end of the world, and still do. And brought me to people like Julia Kinsey, who I never would have thought about, except that you kept pulled into this and around.
You're talking about the stuff that sucked you in, and some of these suburban stories are also fascinating. And so our show is called Minutia Men. So we do dip into minutia. How about giving us some Chicago suburb minutia that we can flop out at a cocktail party for our listeners? You come from such and such. Let me tell you a little bit about that.
Oh my goodness. Now I'm going to draw a blank, but I got to get started here. Lakeview was a suburb to start out with.
Okay.
So where Wrigley Field is now starts as suburban Chicago. Let's see.
So, I drove through Des Plaines the other day, and I see that Des Plaines is founded in like the 1830s or something like that. I mean, it's been around forever.
Yeah, a bunch of communities go back to, they're along rivers. So almost all of them would be around, you'll see along the Des Plaines, along the Chicago, an awful lot along out on the Fox Valley. So if you take Chicago, if you extend your vision of Chicago, and the encyclopedia certainly did, out to the Fox River, Elgin and Aurora and St. Charles and Batavia are all, go down to Elgin along the close to the Illinois River, or Naperville along the DuPage River, the river towns in the 1830s, and they come because it's when the Native Americans, the Potawatomi and their allies in this region, are forced to sign over the last of the land that they're claiming in this region in southern Illinois, in northeastern Illinois and southern Wisconsin in 1833. And so all of these places then immediately then the federal government's going to step in, is going to survey this land, and they're going to start selling it. So people from the East Coast, people from Europe start to pour into this area that had been held by Potawatomi for generations. And so we're going to see in the next decade just an enormous number of communities that are going to be celebrating their 200th anniversary. And it's I think it's going to be a challenge from the standpoint of it's important to celebrate, but it's also important to remember
how we got that land in the first place.
This land belonged to someone else. I just saw an article over the weekend about the Erie Canal is celebrating its 200th anniversary this year,
right?
And that too, it's really this question of it's that transition. So I hope that when we do those celebrations, it'll be that. So there's all of those places in the 1830s, and then there's another whole round of them that come with the railroad. So places like, Des Plaines is along the railroad, so it's a double dip, like Naperville, but Arlington Heights or Palatine or Evanston or Wilmette or Hinsdale are all railroad towns. So they're all places that start with the railroad. Pullman, right, is as the same thing, starts with the railroad. I am not good at cocktail. Sorry, we could come up with I'm trying to think of other things that are kind of fun about places, but there are a whole lot of places that are started in the 1830s.
Well, I live in Mount Prospect. I know it's a railroad inspired town, but it's really only 100 years old, as opposed to some of these other places which are much longer. It does have an older. The railroad, so it's got a railroad settlement, but you're right, in terms of its development as a place is much more tied to the 20th century. Well, thank you for doing this. I know this is...
it's my pleasure.
I like geeking out about stuff like this, and I feel like we've elevated the program with your presence this week.
So. I don't think you've done that, but Rick, keep it up, because this is wonderful stuff, and again, keep digging at your history.
So, how can people follow you? Where can they get some of these incredible books that you've written?
Oh my goodness, I teach out at North Central College. I'm woefully inadequate at social media. So. Well,
it sounds like you're too busy. That's the main reason why.
We keep at it. You take care.
All right. Well, thank you for being on the show.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. There she goes. That's Ann Durkin Keating. And, if you're a listener to this show, I'm a geek. And so I just thank you for sitting through it and helping me geek out a little bit about this town that we love, and that's Chicago, Illinois. All right, we have people to thank. We need to thank Brandon for scoring Ann for us as a guest. Brandon Herman, thanks. Also, our executive producer, Tony Lasano with Opie Productions. We are distributed by Ed Silla with the Radio Misfits Podcast Network. And we'll be back. Dave is coming over on Thursday. We're going to tape a new Minutia Men, and we'll be back very soon with another episode of Minutia Men Celebrity Interview.
The proceeding was a presentation of the Radio Misfits Podcast Network. Find our other great shows on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at RadioMisfits.com. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of Opie Productions.
Tony, can you shut up?